The silence between them was louder than words. In a world that often forgets to pause, to listen, and to feel, two souls had always seemed to dance around one another, close enough to touch, yet careful not to collide. For decades, the world watched them together on screen and off, asking the question no one dared to answer aloud. What if it's real? What if that quiet gaze between them wasn't scripted? What if every smile they shared held a truth no one else was privy to? And now, years later, after heartbreaks, personal losses, and journeys of healing, the world would finally get its answer. But not in a press conference, not in a viral video, not even in a red carpet appearance. It all began in the most unexpected of places, an unassuming cafe tucked away in the backstreets of Kyoto, Japan. Keanu Reeves had always loved Japan, its serenity, its grace, the space it gave him to breathe. After finishing a quiet motorcycle tour across the mountains of Gifu, he arrived in Kyoto for rest. It was supposed to be just him, but fate, always the quiet matchmaker, had different plans. Sandra Bullock arrived a day later, wearing a plain beige trench coat, her face hidden behind large sunglasses and the soft tiredness of someone who had lived too many lifetimes in one. Her last film had wrapped 6 months ago, but her soul still hadn't recovered from what it had cost her. Neither of them had told the other they would be there. And yet neither was surprised when they ran into each other at that quiet cafe, both reaching for the same ceramic cup. It was a moment that could have passed like any other, a quick laugh, a short hug, maybe an exchange of pleasantries before they went their separate ways. But it didn't. Keanu looked at her and she looked at him. And then, without a single word, they sat down at the corner table, the air around them growing still, sacred even, as if time itself had chosen to kneel. For over 2 hours they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. There was something rawer in the silence, a reckoning, an understanding, a shared history that wasn't written in scripts or captured in camera shots. This wasn't about speed or the lake house. It was about everything they had never said. The waitress brought them tea. Keanu's hand brushed Sandra's when he reached for the cup. Neither pulled back. "I thought it was always going to be too late," he finally whispered. She didn't flinch. Maybe it still is. But then she looked up, eyes glassy with the kind of truth no actress could fake, and added softly, "Or maybe this is exactly when it's meant to happen." Outside, rain began to fall, gently, almost respectfully, like the sky didn't want to disturb what was unfolding within. Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out something old, worn, even. It was a black and white photo of the two of them, at some forgotten awards ceremony 20 years ago. Keanu was leaning slightly toward her, whispering something. She was laughing, hand over mouth, pure, unrehearsed. "I've carried this for years," she said, placing it between them on the table. "Every time I've doubted the path I'm on, I've looked at this." He reached out and gently turned the photo upside down, revealing what was written on the back. "Home one day, SB." He read it once, then twice, and the third time he placed his hand over hers and said nothing. He didn't need to. The next morning, news outlets would buzz with rumors. They had been seen boarding a bullet train together. They had checked into the same ryokan. An anonymous staff member said they were smiling a lot but talking little, just enjoying the quiet. But the world didn't know what really happened next. Inside that ancient inn in the heart of Kyoto, where bamboo swayed gently outside paper-thin walls, Keanu knelt beside the futon Sandra sat on, holding a small wooden box that looked as if it had been carved decades ago. "I was waiting for the right time," he said. She shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "Keanu." "I didn't come to propose," he interrupted gently, eyes earnest. "I came to remember, to remind myself of who I am when I'm with you. I brought this because I need to give it to you, not because I expect anything, but because I need you to know." Inside the box was a note, handwritten, folded many times. It was dated 15 years ago. "Sandra, if you ever feel like the world has gone quiet, if you ever feel like everyone's clapping, but you don't feel the music, come find me. I'll be somewhere waiting, with silence and tea and the truth." She read it through trembling hands. "You wrote this for me." He nodded, "But I never sent it. I was scared I'd ruin what we had." She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her chest. "You didn't ruin anything." That night they didn't sleep. They just sat beside one another on the tatami floor, wrapped in blankets, watching the rain through the open sliding door. There were no cameras, no reporters, no statements. Just two people who had spent their lives being everything to everyone else, finally letting themselves just be. The next morning, the staff at the Ryokan found a note on the door of their room. "Please respect our silence. We are not making a statement. We are making a promise. K&S." And just like that, the rumors became something else entirely. No headlines, just whispers. But those whispers were loud enough for the world to hear. They weren't just traveling together. They weren't just reconnecting. They were confirming in the most soul-stirring way what everyone had guessed all along. But the truth was more powerful than gossip. Because this wasn't just love. This was homecoming. The vow that was never spoken. Sandra woke up the next morning to the sound of distant wind chimes and the scent of fresh matcha tea wafting through the open paper screen doors. The Kyoto air was damp with the memory of last night's rain, and light filtered softly through the trees. Keanu had already been awake. He wasn't one to sleep late, not because of habit, but because his dreams rarely gave him peace. He had spent the past hour sitting in the little garden outside their room, cross-legged on a stone slab, watching koi fish move quietly through the pond. When she stepped outside, barefoot and wrapped in a cotton robe, he didn't turn immediately, but when he did, his eyes said everything his lips wouldn't. She sat beside him without a word, letting her shoulder touch his just slightly, enough to remind them both that this wasn't a dream. The past 24 hours had felt like slipping into another lifetime, one they had both imagined at different points in their lives, but had always brushed aside for reasons that no longer mattered. They had careers, responsibilities, public expectations, heartbreaks, fears, and people they had to protect. People who wouldn't understand how deeply two friends could fall in love without warning the world first. They talked sparingly that morning, but it wasn't the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the sacred kind, the kind where every breath felt like a continuation of a sentence long in progress. After breakfast, which was delivered quietly by staff who bowed a little deeper than usual, they took a walk through the bamboo forest trail behind the Ryokan. The path was misty, the air thick with the kind of stillness only nature could hold, and the sound of their feet brushing against the damp gravel was the only interruption. It was during this walk that Sandra finally broke the unspoken question lingering between them. "Why now?" she asked softly, eyes not meeting his yet. "Why not 5 years ago or 10? Keanu paused mid-step and then slowly turned to face her. "Because I didn't believe I deserved this kind of peace back then. I didn't believe I could keep you safe from me, from my solitude, from everything I hadn't healed from." He took her hands gently. "But now, I've spent so many years in silence, and you're the only voice that ever made the silence bearable." Sandra's eyes filled with something deeper than tears. It was recognition of a life lived behind curtains, of love protected behind friendship, of the years that had passed like blurred frames in a film reel no one ever edited. She touched his cheek and said something that had lived inside her heart since they first met on the set of Speed. "I've always known. I just didn't want to make you choose." Keanu smiled in that slow, broken way that only he could, like someone who had learned to build beauty from scars. "You never made me choose, Sandra. Life did, but I'm choosing now with both hands, with everything I am." They continued walking until they reached a small shrine tucked into the corner of the forest. An old monk was sweeping leaves from the stone steps and nodded at them kindly. Inside, a single candle burned beside a wooden statue of Cannon, the goddess of mercy. Sandra lit another candle, her fingers trembling just slightly, and closed her eyes in prayer, not for fame, not for forgiveness, but for the courage to allow joy. Keanu stood beside her, silent but present, and when they opened their eyes again, they both knew something had shifted, not in the world around them, but within. They had both been running from the possibility of being happy together for so long, out of guilt, fear, and the pressure of being public figures. But in that quiet shrine, where no one knew who they were just a man and a woman who had survived everything life had thrown at them. Grief, loss, betrayal, fame, and still found their way back to one another. Back at the inn, Keanu reached into his luggage and pulled out a folded stack of letters he had written but never sent. "I started writing these the day we wrapped the lake house," he explained. "Each one was a moment I wanted to share with you but didn't. I thought maybe one day I'd read them to you when we were old, but I don't want to wait anymore." Sandra sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, her hands folded under her chin, heart pounding with anticipation. He began to read, voice steady but low, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would make the moment vanish. August 9th, 2006, he began. You looked at me after the press event in Berlin like you saw past every answer I gave the reporters. I wanted to ask you to stay another day just to walk around the city together, but I didn't. He read another. May 14th, 2009. I heard you were grieving. I wanted to call. I picked up the phone. I couldn't dial. Then another. October 3rd, 2015. I saw a photo of you with your son, the way you held him. The way you smiled. It reminded me of the photo I keep of you from the rap party, the one where you're laughing at something I said, but I don't remember what. I remember the laugh, though. I always remembered the laugh. Sandra wiped a tear from her cheek and reached out. May I? He handed her the letters. They're yours, always were. That evening, while the world carried on oblivious to the momentous shift happening behind those paper-thin walls, Sandra and Keanu sat by the garden, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the moon rise behind the clouds. You know, she said, I never imagined my life would take this turn. I thought maybe I had missed my window. Keanu chuckled softly. I think the window was always there. We just weren't ready to look through it. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, Then let's jump. No announcement, no social media post, no photos, just a decision. Two hearts tired of pretending, ready to let the truth stretch its wings and take flight. And somewhere in that quiet Japanese village, under the cloak of dusk, a promise was made. Not with rings or vows, but with presence, with the raw courage to choose love in a world that had told them it was too late. A journey that never needed headlines. The morning after their quiet candlelit moment in Kyoto, the wind carried a gentler chill, and yet something in the air felt warmer, like two souls that had finally stopped running and learned to sit still in each other's presence. There were no fireworks, no dramatic proclamations, just two people walking side by side through a world that, for once, wasn't demanding a performance from them. Keanu and Sandra left the Ryokan early, traveling light, without assistants, agents, or security detail. They didn't need an entourage to feel important. They had each other now, and that was more grounding than any award or box office success could ever be. They boarded a small train to Nara, a city known for its calm deer, quiet temples, and timeless beauty. It wasn't part of any planned itinerary, just a mutual decision made with a single glance. They were no longer looking for the next headline moment. They were following a feeling. On the train, Sandra rested her head on Keanu's shoulder, the rhythm of the rails soothing her like a lullaby. He read a small book of haiku in his hands, stopping every now and then to underline something with his finger before reading it softly into her ear. What are you underlining? She asked, eyes still half closed. The ones that feel like us, he replied, voice low and deliberate. One in particular stood out. No need to announce the arrival of springtime / cherry blossoms bloom. She smiled faintly and whispered, That's exactly what this feels like. They reached Nara just before sunset, and the streets were painted in hues of burnt orange and lavender. Deer approached them fearlessly, as if sensing the peace that radiated between them. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small packet of rice crackers he had picked up from a vending machine. Sandra giggled as he fed them to the animals with a kind of reverence that reminded her why she fell in love with him in the first place. Not because he was Keanu Reeves, the star, but because he was Keanu, the man who saw dignity in all things, even the smallest. They walked hand in hand through the ancient paths, finally arriving at Tadaijai Temple, its grandeur humbling, its silence reverent. They didn't take selfies. They didn't document the moment for social media. They simply stood before the massive Buddha statue and in that quiet expanse exchanged something deeper than words, a spiritual nod, a soul's handshake. Later that night, in a modest guest house tucked away on the outskirts of the city, they sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small river. Lanterns floated downstream, part of a local ritual to honor loved ones past. Sandra placed a lantern on the water's edge and paused. This one's for Brian, she whispered, referring to her late partner. Keanu placed his hand over hers. And this one's for Jennifer, he added, naming his lost daughter. Together, they pushed the two lanterns into the stream and watched as the flames floated gently into the darkness. It was not an act of sadness. It was a quiet celebration of memory, of pain honored, of lives intertwined by the invisible threads of grief and resilience. For the first time in years, neither felt the need to hide their sorrow behind sarcasm, humor, or public poise. They were simply two people with bruised hearts, now holding space for each other to heal. Over tea that night, Sandra confessed something she had carried for too long. There were moments, moments when I felt you pulling away, and I convinced myself it was all in my head, that I had imagined the connection. Keanu looked at her, eyes heavy with regret but also redemption. It wasn't in your head, it was in my chest, but I was too afraid to open it. I thought if I loved you, I'd break everything sacred between us. She nodded slowly. But you didn't, you only made it deeper. He reached into his bag and handed her something he hadn't shown anyone, an old cassette tape from the 90s. What is this? She asked, squinting at the handwritten label. It simply read, "For the days I don't have the courage," he smiled. "It's my voice talking to you from 20 years ago." She pressed the tape to her chest. "You kept this all these years?" "No," he said. "It kept me." The next day, they took a slow bus to Osaka. Along the way, they stopped at a small village where time seemed to have paused 50 years ago. Children ran barefoot through dusty streets, and old men played go under the shade of ancient trees. There was no recognition here. No one pointed. No one whispered their names. It was a freedom they hadn't tasted in decades. An elderly woman waved them into her tea house and served them sweet dango and roasted barley tea. They sat in the back corner, exchanging quiet glances and gentle laughter. The old woman approached again and placed a tiny clay figurine between them, a bride and groom hand-molded, imperfect but endearing. "You two are blessed," she said in broken English. "You shine like those who have lived before, not just met now." Sandra clutched the figurine, her hands trembling with the weight of that truth. Keanu kissed the top of her head and whispered, "Maybe we have. Maybe we've always been finding each other." When they returned to the city, their phones began to buzz. Not because they had posted anything, but because someone had seen them. A blurry photo taken from across a park, a shot of Keanu tucking Sandra's hair behind her ear, both of them wearing matching gray coats. The internet exploded. Speculation turned into frenzy. Are Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock secretly together in Japan? Romantic escape or new film project? The headlines ran wild, but the couple remained quiet. They didn't issue a statement. They didn't deny it. They didn't feed the flames. Instead, they turned off their phones, climbed to the rooftop of a modest apartment Keanu had rented years ago for writing trips, and watched the chaos from above, detached, grounded, real. As stars filled the sky, Sandra looked over and said, "You know they're going to follow us after this." Keanu nodded. "Let them." She raised a brow. "You ready for that?" He turned to her, eyes soft, voice firm. "I'm ready for you." And then for the first time they kissed, not like actors, not like friends pretending for the camera, but like two people who had waited their entire lives for the moment when the world would no longer matter. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't planned. It was the kind of kiss that heals old wounds and silences every doubt. By morning, a letter had been sent to their managers. It was simple. "We're not looking for roles. We're looking for peace. We're not promoting a movie. We're beginning a life. Please respect that." It was signed K and S. And just like that, the truth was out, not through gossip, but through grace, not through scandal, but through surrender. And still, there was more to come. Because love like this doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives and stays. Like the quiet ring. There's something about returning to Lowe's Angels after disappearing into Japan's stillness that feels like falling back into noise. The city breathes with ambition. Its boulevards echo with urgency, and every street corner feels like a stage. Keanu and Sandra stepped off the plane not into fame, but into a familiar chaos they had long since outgrown. But this time their steps were aligned, not in the careful choreography of red carpets or press tour, but in the unspoken rhythm of two hearts that had finally surrendered to truth. Their fingers remained lightly intertwined through customs, unnoticed beneath the brim of hats and behind oversized sunglasses. But they weren't hiding anymore. They were just choosing peace. The world had spent decades guessing, hoping, romanticizing the chemistry they radiated in films and interviews. Now, for the first time, they were no longer characters in someone else's narrative. They were authors of their own. Back at Keanu's home in the Hollywood Hills, a place that felt less like a celebrity mansion and more like a sanctuary carved out of time, there were no flashing lights. No paparazzi had caught them, not yet, and even if they did, nothing would change. The gates closed behind them and Sandra exhaled as she stepped out of the car and looked over the valley. "It feels the same," she said. Keanu stepped beside her. "It's always felt like a waiting room," he replied. "Like I was waiting for life to actually start." She turned toward him. "And now," he slipped his hand into hers, "now it's a home." That evening they cooked together. Not the performative kind of cooking couples do to post on Instagram, but the quiet, healing kind, cutting vegetables shoulder to shoulder, sharing space in the kind of intimacy that doesn't need to be announced. She stirred miso broth while he sliced tofu, and somewhere between boiling water and washing dishes, Sandra laughed in a way she hadn't in years, not because of something funny, but because she felt safe enough to. "You've changed," she said gently, drying her hands. Keanu leaned against the counter, holding a small towel. "So have you," he said, "but I think we grew in the same direction." Later, they sat in the living room, no television, no music, just the warm hum of city lights seeping through the windows. Keanu disappeared into the hallway and returned holding a small, handmade wooden box. Sandra's eyes locked on it, immediately knowing it wasn't new. "You still have that?" she asked, voice low. He nodded and sat down beside her. "I made it after Speed. I didn't know why at the time. I just needed to make something with my hands." He opened the box, revealing two simple rings, neither adorned with diamonds or grandeur, just polished wood and metal fused together. "I had a friend in Iceland make these with me. They represent things lost and found. Oakwood from my childhood home, steel from a broken chain I used to carry on my motorcycle." Sandra touched one of the rings with the tip of her finger. "You kept both all these years?" He nodded. "I never knew who I was saving them for until I saw you in Kyoto reaching for that cup." She picked up the thinner ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It's never been about the ceremony," she whispered. "Never about the spotlight. It's always been about the stillness," Keanu finished. "They didn't call it an engagement. They didn't call it anything. It didn't need a name. It was a vow exchanged in silence." The following weeks passed in a kind of suspended reality. They spent mornings walking barefoot in the backyard garden, sipping tea while watching hummingbirds dance around lavender. Afternoons were spent reading, writing, or sometimes sitting in silence while classical music played softly in the background. Evenings were sacred, filled with long conversations about everything they had never said. Sandra talked about motherhood, about how being a parent changed her center of gravity, made her fierce and fragile in the same breath. Keanu opened up about loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that lingers even in crowded rooms. "People think I'm a mystery," he said once, "but I've just been protecting something I didn't think anyone could hold." She reached across the space between them and held his hand. "Then let me hold it now." Despite their efforts to remain private, word eventually slipped. Not through scandal, but through curiosity. A blurry image at a bookstore in Pasadena. A waiter's whispered account of them reading poetry over lunch. Tabloids speculated wildly. Headlines ranged from secret wedding to are Keanu and Sandra finally a couple? But the truth was deeper than gossip could reach. They weren't a couple. They were a constellation, stars that had orbited each other for decades, finally aligning. And yet the world was watching now. That changed things, or at least it tried to. One afternoon, Sandra received a call from her publicist. "People are asking, Sandra, they want a quote, they want a statement, just something." She looked across the room at Keanu, who was sitting by the window with his guitar, strumming absent-mindedly. She turned back to the phone. "Then give them this," she said calmly. "We're not confirming or denying anything, we're simply living, and right now life feels like home." They agreed not to post anything themselves. No wedding photos, no official announcement. Instead, they held a private gathering in Big Sur, just a few close friends, no photographers. The ceremony wasn't traditional. There was no white dress, no tuxedo. Sandra wore a blue linen gown, her hair down and barefoot in the grass. Keanu wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a small flower tucked into the pocket. They stood under a crooked cypress tree, the Pacific Ocean behind them roaring with blessing, and exchanged those same two rings from the box, each sliding them onto the other's finger with a look that said more than any vow. After the ceremony, they sat by a fire, arms around each other, watching their guests toast marshmallows and share stories. There was no DJ, no dance floor, just acoustic guitar, laughter, and the sound of wind. At one point, Keanu stood up and took a deep breath. "I used to think I wasn't meant for joy," he said quietly to the small crowd, "that maybe I had already used up my share in this life. But then Sandra reminded me that joy doesn't expire. You just have to be brave enough to let it back in." She rose beside him, eyes glassy with quiet pride. "And sometimes," she added, "the best love stories aren't loud, they're just true." After the weekend, they returned to their home. The world still speculated, still searched for photos, still waited for confirmation. But none ever came, not because they were hiding, but because they didn't need to explain something so sacred. Their love wasn't a performance, it wasn't for public consumption. It was lived in early morning sunlight, in the way they brewed each other's coffee, in the poems they left on each other's pillows. It was a quiet revolution against a world obsessed with spectacle. And perhaps that's why it felt so powerful. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary love stories are the ones lived without applause. Like love without permission. In the weeks following the quiet wedding in Big Sur, time slowed down for Keanu and Sandra in a way it never had before. Not because the world around them changed, it didn't. The entertainment industry still spun like a relentless wheel, and headlines still searched for clickbait. But something within them had shifted. For the first time in decades, they weren't performing, weren't appeasing, weren't adjusting themselves to fit the expectations of agents, studios, or fans. They were simply living, and doing so with a kind of grace that only people who had lost and healed could understand. Keanu's days were no longer built around scripts or flights or meetings. He spent mornings on the porch with his dog at his feet and a notebook on his lap, scribbling ideas not for anyone else, but for himself. Sandra, too, found peace in this unhurried rhythm. Her days filled with gardening, journaling, long walks, and learning to cook dishes they had once tried on set between takes, back when love was still something they danced around with careful feet. But despite the peace, there were moments when the outside world tried to intrude. It started subtly, an aggressive paparazzi car following them through Laurel Canyon, a reporter ambushing her at a charity event with a rehearsed smile and two curious eyes. "Are the rumors true?" they asked, voice dipped in sugar but sharp with expectation. "Did you two finally tie the knot?" Sandra never answered directly. She had mastered the art of the sidestep. "I think love is something we live, not something we define," she'd say with that disarming smile, leaving headlines to swirl without anchors. Keanu handled it differently. He said nothing at all, but his silence was not avoidance, it was protection. He had seen too many precious things get broken by overexposure. What they had now was not fragile, but it was sacred. And sacred things deserved reverence, not spectacle. The world wanted proof. A photo, a statement, a slip-up. But Keanu and Sandra had something rarer than public validation. They had intention. Every day was a choice, small, quiet, but deliberate. From the way Keanu would warm up Sandra's car before she stepped out on a cold morning to the way she would leave handwritten notes tucked into the pages of his books. "Keep going," one would say. "I see you," another. Their love didn't erupt, it bloomed. It showed up in tiny gestures. Like the way they reached for each other's hands instinctively when they crossed a street, or the way they could finish each other's stories with just a look. There were nights when Sandra would fall asleep on the couch, a script in her lap, and Keanu would quietly cover her with a blanket and stay beside her, watching the fire die down. These weren't grand gestures for an audience. These were the small, invisible things, the real things, that love is built on. Then came the offer. A renowned director, someone they both respected, reached out with a proposal for a new film. A quiet, introspective love story about second chances, loss, and rediscovery. The kind of role that didn't just entertain but transformed. And more importantly, it was written for them. "It's not a movie unless both of you say yes," the director wrote. At first, they hesitated. They had just begun building a life away from cameras, away from the machine. But then, sitting at their kitchen table one late afternoon, Keanu turned to Sandra and said, "Maybe this isn't going back. Maybe this is taking what we have and giving it a new language." She thought about it, tracing the rim of her mug slowly. "Would we do press, promotions, red carpets?" He shook his head. "Only what we're comfortable with, only if we stay in control of the story." She looked at him, really looked at him, and then smiled. "Then let's do it, not because they want us to, but because we want to." Filming began 3 months later in Mendocino County. A quiet coastal town, foggy in the mornings and golden by sunset. The crew was small. The set minimal, the story raw. It was about two people who met young, lost each other through the tides of life, and then reconnected in their 50s, not with fanfare but with quiet understanding. It was, in so many ways, their own story wearing different clothes. There were scenes where their real emotions bled into the characters, moments when Sandra would look into Keanu's eyes and see everything they had survived. Moments when Keanu would hold her not as the character he played, but as the man who had waited half a lifetime for this kind of peace. The cinematographer once whispered to a crew member, "They're not acting, they're remembering." What made the project unique wasn't just the performances, but how they approached it. They insisted on minimal makeup, natural lighting, and real-time takes. "We want this to feel like life," Sandra told the director, "not cinema." Keanu, in one scene, improvised a line that wasn't in the script. He looked at her, held her hand, and said, "I don't care how late it is, I just care that we're here now." The director kept it in. Later, he said it was the most honest moment he'd ever captured on film. Off camera, they still maintained their quiet routine. Mornings started with herbal tea and silent walks along the cliffside. Evenings ended with board games, reading by lamplight, or simply sitting in rocking chairs as the ocean roared beneath them. One night after a long shoot, they returned to their cottage, tired, wind-blown, and soaked from a spontaneous rainstorm. Sandra collapsed on the couch, laughing. "I haven't been this soaked since that waterfall scene in Costa Rica," Keanu chuckled, tossing her a dry towel. "And you still look better than I did." She leaned back, looking at the raindrops trickle down the window. "You ever think about how weird this all is?" she asked. "We spent years dancing around this. And now we're married, living in the woods, making movies about it." He sat beside her. "It's not weird," he said. "It's finally true." She turned to him, eyes serious now. "You think we were always meant to end up here?" He took her hand, kissed her knuckles gently, and said, "Not meant, but made. We made this, Sandra, choice by choice." The film wrapped after 8 weeks. The final scene was set on a pier at dawn, just the two of them sitting side by side, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun rise. No words, just presence. When the director called cut, the crew stood silent for a long moment before breaking into applause. Not because of a performance, but because they had witnessed something rare, two people who had turned life into art without compromising either. A few photos leaked during post-production, grainy shots of them laughing behind the monitor, walking hand in hand through the redwoods. But they didn't rush to control the narrative. They let the images speak for themselves. Then one morning, the world woke up to a quiet announcement. Not a tabloid scoop, not a paparazzi frenzy, but a one-line caption posted from the studio's official account, accompanied by a black and white still from the film. The caption read, "They've been telling this story all along. We just finally caught up." No tags, no hashtags, no explanation. The comments exploded, fans wept, celebrities cheered, but Keanu and Sandra didn't reply. They were already somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, somewhere private, where the story continued even after the cameras stopped. Because real love, timeless love, doesn't wait for permission. It just lives. The promise that needed no words. The quiet hum of morning life filled their kitchen, the clink of porcelain cups, the low groan of the espresso machine, and the gentle rustling of the breeze through the open windows. A robin chirped somewhere outside, and the aroma of fresh ground coffee blended with jasmine from the garden. Keanu leaned against the counter, wearing a soft black robe, watching Sandra from across the room. She was barefoot, hair messy, humming faintly to herself as she buttered toast. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment, and yet it was everything. It was the final piece of a life he never thought he'd have. No cameras, no rehearsals, no take-twos. Just a kitchen, 2 mugs, shared glances, and a deep, wordless understanding that they were no longer carrying their lives alone. Their film had become a quiet phenomenon. It hadn't exploded at the box office, but it didn't need to. It made people feel. Critics called it a meditation on love, memory, and second chances. Awards buzzed in hushed circles, but Keanu and Sandra stayed away from the noise. They didn't attend the premieres, didn't walk the red carpets. Instead, they watched the film one night alone in their living room, feet curled beneath blankets, flickering candlelight reflecting off the television screen. When the final scene faded to black, Sandra turned to him, eyes glistening. "It's the only film I've ever done where I didn't have to act." Keanu nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We lived it. That's why it hurts so beautifully." She smiled, laid her head on his chest, and whispered, "I think we finally made peace with all the almosts in our past." In the months that followed, they settled into a rhythm neither of them had ever known. Not the hurried rhythm of sets and studios, but the quiet tempo of ordinary life. They planted a vegetable garden. They hosted small dinners with only people who truly knew them, not as movie stars, but as humans. They read books out loud to each other in the evenings. Sandra took up painting again. Keanu built furniture with his hands, wood that held imperfections he refused to sand out. "The cracks are the best part," he said once, running his hand over a jagged corner of a bench he crafted. "They remind me that strength doesn't mean being flawless. It means standing even after being broken." She kissed his forehead and replied, "Then we're made of the same wood." They traveled, but differently than before. No longer for press tour or productions. Now they visited places slowly, staying longer in quiet towns, befriending strangers who had no idea who they were, renting homes instead of hotels. In Tuscany, they cooked together with a retired chef who taught them to make pasta by hand. In Iceland, they walked across black sand beaches and stood in silence as the northern lights danced above them. In Kyoto, they returned to the ryokan where it all began. The staff remembered them, not as celebrities, but as the quiet couple who asked for no attention, just tea and peace. The same room was waiting, the same small table. And this time, as they sat together sipping tea, Keanu reached into his bag and placed a new note on the table. It read, "You found me before I even knew I was lost. You waited for me before I even knew you were the destination. And now, you are the quiet I choose every day." K. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she read it. She looked up at him with a gaze that spoke of lifetimes. You never stopped writing, she whispered. He took her hands gently. You're the only story I've ever wanted to finish. But even within the quiet, there were challenges. Sandra's adopted daughter had questions. She was young, intuitive, and fiercely protective of her mother. One evening, while Keanu helped her with homework, she asked, "Are you going to leave her one day like others did?" The question hit him harder than any interviewer's ambush or critic's review ever had. He set the pencil down slowly and looked her in the eyes. "I've spent most of my life afraid to love people because I didn't want to lose them. But your mom, she taught me that love isn't about protecting yourself. It's about being brave enough to stay, even when it's hard." The little girl studied his face for a moment, then nodded and went back to her math. But something shifted that day, not just in the child, but in Keanu himself. He was no longer just Sandra's partner. He was her family. As the one-year anniversary of their quiet wedding approached, Sandra planned a surprise. Not something grand or lavish, but something meaningful. She reached out to a small community theater in Santa Fe, one they had once visited in their 20s while filming. She rented the space for one evening, decorated it with fairy lights, and invited no one but Keanu. When he arrived, confused but curious, she handed him a program. It read, "One night only, a love letter in 3 acts." She had written and directed it herself. 3 short scenes, performed by local actors. The first was a depiction of their first meeting on the set of Speed. The second, a moment from the lake house, but with imagined conversations between scenes. The third, a dramatization of their silent cafe moment in Kyoto. As Keanu watched from the front row, his hand covering his mouth, tears streaming silently, he saw himself and Sandra in those actors. He saw their missteps, their hesitations, their near misses, but most of all he saw their arrival. After the final curtain fell, he stood and walked onto the stage, pulling her into an embrace. No words were spoken, just breath, heartbeat, and the quiet roar of everything they had endured to reach this moment. Back home that night, Sandra whispered while brushing her teeth, "You didn't say anything after the play." He smiled, leaned against the doorframe, and said, "I couldn't. There are some things too beautiful to interrupt with language." The next morning, they received a letter from the Academy. A nomination for both of them, Best Actor, Best Actress. Their performances had resonated deeply, but instead of attending the ceremony, they chose something else. They wrote a letter published quietly in the New York Times. "We are deeply honored, but tonight we're celebrating something different. We're celebrating the courage to be quiet in a world that's too loud. We're celebrating the choice to love, not for attention, but for truth. Thank you for watching our story." But the best parts, they were never filmed. They signed it simply, Keanu and Sandra. That evening, as cameras flashed in Hollywood and dresses shimmered beneath chandeliers, Keanu and Sandra sat in their garden, wrapped in a shared blanket, sipping tea under a canopy of stars. There were no trophies on the table, no red carpets beneath their feet, just the cool earth, the scent of rosemary in the air, and the sound of 2 lives finally, fully intertwined. She looked at him and asked, "If the world forgets about us tomorrow, would you be okay?" He reached for her hand, kissed her wrist gently, and answered, "They can forget everything as long as we remember this." In the end, it wasn't about marriage. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about proving that love could last. It was about becoming whole, and doing it not loudly but faithfully, every day. Because real love never asks for attention. It just keeps showing up. In the silence, in the spaces between words, in the way 2 souls finally find their way home. Like the end.